I just really love learning, but I found that I hated school. I think the humanities is just being overshadowed, which is a terrible thing.
We're all like unconsciously being pulled around by different forces at play. The self-worth doesn't come from other people's approval. It has to come from within. And that takes a lot of work.
You're really never too young or too old to get started. So it's always good to start young, explore new things. You never know what sticks. Without purpose, like you can't find true happiness. Now looking back, I would just say that everything works out in the end.
Welcome to the Pursuit of Light podcast. Well, this is the first episode, and I'm honored to have Emma Zhang, one of my friends I met in high school, as my very first guest. So, Emma, could you please introduce yourself?
Yeah, sure. So thank you. I'm honored to be on this podcast and even more honored to be the first guest. That's really cool. So as Justin mentioned, we were classmates in high school, but strangely, we never really had any classes or talked much until like 2 weeks before graduation, which when I think about it now, it's kind of crazy, but we made the most out of those 2 weeks and we kind of continued having conversations and that kind of ended up here, which is pretty cool. So right now I'm a freshman in college. I attend Minerva University, which I guess we'll get more into in the podcast. So I'm not going to explain too much about it now, but it's very unconventional. It's very untraditional. It's just crazy, very chaotic, but super, super fun.
Yeah, that's great. It's pretty funny because like I kind of knew you back in high school, but we only connected during the very last month. But it's better late than never. So all right, so I wanted to ask, you talked about Minerva University. For those of the people who are listening, how would you describe Minerva? Because most people, when they think of college, they think of what's like the most prestigious, what's the most famous. But what is Minerva?
Yeah, so it is basically none of those things, like in a nutshell.
Yeah.
And it's so funny because I have so many pitches of Minerva because no one's ever heard of it. And for those of you listening, you probably never heard of it either. But I would describe it as the opposite of a traditional university. So, like Justin mentioned, when I say university, what comes to mind is usually like dorms, you have campuses, you have cafeterias, you have classes, tests, professors, and we have some of those, but it's kind of just flipped on its head. So, for example, we are on a global rotation, which means we travel to 6 or 7 different countries throughout the course of 4 years. We still end up with a bachelor's degree, we just do it in different locations, which is pretty interesting. So, right now I'm in San Francisco, so pretty close to home, but next year I'll be in Taipei and Seoul, and then Argentina, and then India, and so on and so forth. And we also have no campus, which is kind of, I guess for some people they really like it. Like for me, I love it because it really forces you to get out of your dorm and into the city. Minerva likes to say that the city is your campus, which is honestly very true. And because we don't have a campus, we also don't have cafeteria. So you have to be super independent to survive on your own. If you're hungry, you have to either cook or eat out. And obviously, San Francisco is very expensive. So you pretty much have to learn to cook, which is a skill that I would say most college students don't learn until fairly late. If I were to take a guess at that, you can correct me if I'm wrong though. And then, yeah, there's just a lot of independence. And then as for classes, they use a very innovative, I would say, curricula. So instead of doing tests and exams like traditional education, Minerva just gets rid of that. We don't have any lectures, we don't have any tests, midterms, finals, quizzes, none of that. We just have assignment-based learning. It's not exactly project-based learning, although we have a ton of projects. It's more just seminar-based and discussion-based. So essentially, you learn the topic and knowledge on your own, and then you go to class and you discuss with your classmates. So it's capped at 20 students per class, super small. You get to know everybody. It's super neat. And then after that, you have assignments where you go and apply what you learn in class to the real world. So it's kind of the education model flipped on its head. And I think one of my favorite parts is the international student body, which I think is an overlooked fact because people usually get so hung up on the fact that it's global rotation. But I think I've learned the most this first year just being around people from different cultures. So, for example, in my year, the class of 2027, we have around 200 students and we represent 52 different countries. So we have a yeah, it's a very diverse student
Yeah.
body, and we just learn a ton, like not even just cultural differences, but just ways of thinking. There's so much respectful dialogue going on. You really get your own views challenged, but you definitely get to practice articulating your own views and updating them as you see fit.
And that's like a really concise introduction of your university. Yeah, I guess like for those listening, like why did you choose Minerva? Because like obviously there's a plethora number of like universities to choose from. And why did you think that university was your best fit? And why did you decide to do something a little bit different?
Yeah, that's a good question. So, as some backstory, I guess, so we grew up in the same high school, basically. I mean,
Yeah,
you
yeah,
are at Valley way before me,
yeah.
but for those listeners who don't know, we basically grew up in Silicon Valley, where everybody's super set on going to a top-notch college. Prestige is basically thrown all over the place. But something that I learned in high school about myself is that I really like learning. So, for example, during summer, I never attended like summer programs that cost like $10,000. I don't like they're
Yeah.
crazy expensive now, but I never really invested in those. I more just went online and took free online courses on topics that I found interesting. So, for example, the summer before college, I was kind of bored because there's nothing really to do. So I decided to take, I think, 4 classes on like civil liberties. I learned about Western
Mm,
philosophy, the Great War, and modern philosophy. So I just really love learning. But I found that I hated school, which I think is pretty relatable for the
yeah, yeah,
majority of students. I mean,
yeah.
maybe some people love school, but that wasn't me. And that realization hit during COVID, during quarantine, and that was our sophomore year, I think, when we were at
Mm,
home. And during that time, I was like, you know what? I don't think like the traditional school system is for me because I know that, like I said, I love learning and school is supposed to be a place for learning, but I just didn't like it. So that must mean there's something wrong with the system and I want to see if there's alternatives. So obviously, I was in high school at that time. I wasn't really thinking that much about college. I explored independent study, homeschooling, like just alternative education, and there's not that much, I think, just because traditional school is just societally acceptable at this point. But then I stumbled upon Minerva University and I decided to apply. So I did, and now I'm here. So yeah, I started pretty early, but I knew from pretty early on that it was somewhere that I wanted to be.
yeah, yeah, for sure. Because like I remember like at least some point in our high school years, like we probably went on Google and searched like, why do I love to learn, but why do I hate school?
Yeah.
And then all across, Reddit, Quora forums, you see people like voicing the same, like their same opinions towards formal education today. And I feel like, in today's world where everything's so advanced, where technology, there's new things coming out and about, we're still living in a system that kind of dated back to the Industrial Revolution that hasn't changed much, throughout the decades. And as the world continues to progress and higher education continues to exist, what are some like alternatives you see in higher education, and what what are some things that higher education could do better on?
Yeah, that's a really good question. And
Yeah.
I actually see that in the future, I think that the education industry is changing really fast, especially with developments of universities like Minerva. I think
Mm,
Minerva is more of the well-known ones within the industry of innovative higher ed. But in recent years, actually, there have been a lot more universities that do very similar things with global rotation that I just found out about, which is pretty cool. So I think it really paves the way for other institutions to begin kind of learning also how to integrate innovative learning into the curricula. And I think a lot of top universities have also tried to entertain the fact. The thing is, it's just harder for them, I would say, to turn or become more innovative just because they've been around for so long. And, the longer that an establishment has been there, the harder it is for them to change and uproot. But I think as we move towards the future, and I think we'll talk about this more, but college degrees are becoming less and less relevant. I think there's more students that will be seeking alternative paths, whether that be like innovative higher education institutes or just maybe no college, which is
mhm.
which is pretty different from, I think, what we graduated into.
Yeah, for sure. I guess like given that Minerva kind of boasts this unique learning curriculum, is there like a favorite course that you've taken, and what did you learn out of it?
Yeah, so for some background context, all first year Minervan, so Minerva students, we take the same classes. So we only have four, and Minerva calls them cornerstone courses because they set the foundation for whatever you study in the future. So they're kind of like core classes for whatever major you choose to do.
Yeah.
And out of those four, one is called multimodal communications, and it covers, I would say, I mean, the name kind of covers it. It's just
Yeah.
communication across multiple modes, I guess. But it's really interesting because it's not only what high school English teaches, which is mostly just text, right? Like how to write essays, how to, take the AP
Right.
test or whatever. But we also talk about music. We learn how to interpret music. Right now we're learning about games, which I thought was so cool. Like we had to interpret video games and see what elements they
Mhm.
use, which I've never learned about in my life. But I think it's really interesting. What else did we do? We learned about photography. We had to make a short film some time ago. So it's just learning how to articulate well and how to communicate effectively throughout whatever medium that you choose, which I really like. I wouldn't say that's my favorite class though, because it gets better. And then the next
Yeah.
one, I'll just go over all my cornerstones real quick. So the next one is called empirical analysis, and this is, I guess, the equivalent of science. So it talks about the scientific process, how to design experiments, how to design surveys. They focus a lot on real world applications. So we talk about biases. So, cognitive biases, how
Mhm.
reliable is testimony? That was a big question we focused on. And then the next class is formal analysis. So it complements empirical analyses in that empirical analyses is all about, empirical observation, whereas formal analyses is all about theory. So this is where coding comes in. And I think the first unit that we learned was all classical logic, which I never did in high school. I know some of my classmates did, but I was like, what a great way to be in college. I mean, I think everyone should learn some good
Yeah.
classical logic. So it's really focused on theory. Right now, we're learning about game theory, which is probably my favorite unit.
Oh
And
yeah.
then my last cornerstone, which is my personal favorite, it's called complex systems. And this is the equivalent of, I'll say, social science. It's not, I wouldn't say equivalent though, because it's not about memorization like I thought, maybe APUSH was or, AP Gov. It was mostly memorization. But complex systems is more like analyzing how like society works and why we have conflicts and what we can do to resolve those conflicts. So, for example, I wrote a blog a while ago about analyzing political polarization in the US. And basically, all the tools I use there, I use like networks, I talked about system dynamics and emergent properties. All of those, I'll say techniques, we call them HCs. I don't know how to explain it well,
Yep.
but it's kind of patterns of thinking those are taught in that class. And I think right now we're learning about negotiation, we learned about mediation, and man, what are we doing right now? I think we're still on that unit, but yeah,
Yeah.
I don't even know. Like we just cover so much stuff, but it's really fun. And I think I'm more of a social sciences person, so I really enjoy that class. Although all of them
Mhm.
are great, honestly.
Yeah, that sounds like a lot of interesting knowledge packed into like one or two classes. Yeah, I guess like for a traditional university that maybe has these courses, except in like a lecture formats, how does Minerva teach? Because maybe higher universities that are like formal under the formal education system, and Minerva may teach like similar things, but Minerva does teach it in a different way. So could you explain a little how the whole like teaching and learning style works for
Mhm.
Minerva?
So I guess as a disclaimer, I never really went to a traditional college, so I can't really compare and
Yeah,
contrast
yeah,
my experiences, but maybe you can. So I would love to hear what you experienced at UCLA. But I would say there's two main differences. So one is the what they teach, so kind of not necessarily knowledge, but the curricula, I guess. And then the second one is how they teach it. So starting with what they teach, I think what we learn is pretty different, at least from what I experienced in high school. So like I briefly talked about, high school was all about memorization. We had to
yeah,
take AP tests, we had to take SAT, ACT, I don't even know
yeah.
anymore.
Oh, yeah.
And that really doesn't gauge anything other than how good are you at taking the standardized test, right?
Yeah.
So usually kids that are good at memorizing or good at process of elimination do really well, but in reality, they might not actually understand the material. So Minerva doesn't really focus on memorization. So like I said, we don't have any tests or quizzes. So when I'm doing class, I don't have a pressure to memorize anything. So for example, in high school, if I was, let's say, an AP Gov, I would be taking notes. I'd be like, oh man, I have a quiz in two
Oh yeah.
days. This is gonna be on the quiz. I need to memorize this when I get home. But at Minerva, we don't have that time pressure of I have to get this into my brain. I'll just memorize it if I don't have time to understand it theoretically. So it's definitely less pressure in that aspect, I guess. So they don't really focus on teaching knowledge. They focus on teaching patterns of thinking, which I briefly talked about before also. We call them HCs, which stand for habits of mind and foundational concepts. Yeah,
Yeah.
that's what it stands for. And it's kind of just problem solving approaches. So how do you approach a problem, a situation, anything that you would encounter in the real life? And what are some, I guess, default foundational mental skills that you can take to analyze them? So again, it's not about knowledge because I think knowledge
Mm.
changes so fast, right? Like what you learn one day might not even be relevant the next day. And I think
Right.
my favorite example would be the invention of the calculator, right? Prior to that, you would have to memorize, you would have to know how to use what like the abacus or whatever,
Oh yeah, yeah, yeah.
and you would have to do it by hand.
Uh-huh.
But as soon as the calculator was invented, like arithmetic basically went away. And we can kind of see that innovation slowly being integrated into our high school math classes because now we have calculator sections, but we also have no calculator sections. So the transition is slow, but it's definitely there. And I think I really like that example because in this age where everything is changing so fast, especially where we live, high tech is developing at like very fast speeds. So exactly like what we learned today in school, and if you just memorize it, you don't understand it completely. You don't understand the process of it or its applications. That knowledge is honestly going to be useful tomorrow, and that's assuming that you don't forget it tomorrow because you just shoved it into your
Yeah.
brain and memorized it. So I think that's the first part about like what they teach. So it's more about critical thinking, the knowledge, and then moving on to how they teach. So I think I talked about this previously too, but we don't have lectures at all. So we have class, but we don't have lectures, which means that all of them are seminar based. We have to learn all the material, learn all the knowledge ourselves, which are normally case studies, if that makes sense. So they teach us like critical thinking skills, but we study the applications ahead of time. And then we go to class and then discuss those applications, evaluate them, and determine their effectiveness. And then using our updated knowledge, we then apply them to assignments. So I
Mm.
guess the only knowledge that we're learning, and we do learn a lot, I would say, is from self-study, which happens before the class. So it's kind of completely flipped. Like you don't go to class to learn, you learn on your own, and you go to class to solidify
Mm.
that knowledge.
Oh, that's a really comprehensive explanation. Yeah, I feel like a lot of education today, we really focus on subjects that are kind of becoming really irrelevant because of how fast the world is changing. And I feel like what you described in Minerva, you guys really dig deep into kind of the principles of everything behind what's going on in society, which I think is really interesting because there's this whole like graph saying how like there's different speeds at which human knowledge is moving about, and at the very like core of it is human nature, where it kind of remains like I guess like a static for throughout most of history because of how innate and how predictable humans are. And I think by studying, the more foundational concepts of humanity and society, I think you really can get that foundation that can be applied to almost any single discipline you decide to
Hmm.
choose. So that's amazing.
Yeah, I think that's the philosophy. So it's
Yeah.
more of teaching you and equipping you with the skills to succeed in whatever world that you find yourself in. Like maybe not even this world, but it's just
Yeah.
the patterns of thinking that are the most important to navigate complex situations.
Yeah. This is like saying that kind of describes how like people who like take philosophy and a lot of philosophy majors, they actually do really well in the real world because of how they're able to kind of like think deeply and think
Hmm.
with reason into things that can be applied to like so many different things. So that just comes
For
to mind.
sure.
Yeah.
And speaking of philosophy, like I think everybody, at least where we grew up, like all the focus was on STEM. And I feel like that's
Oh
one
yeah.
of the big problems that I see with society right now, and we might get into this later, but just briefly touching on it, I think the humanities is just being overshadowed, which is a terrible thing because like you mentioned, like knowledge can only take you so far, right? But I think
Yeah.
fundamentally it's the way that you think, and that's what, classical logic, that's what philosophy really teaches you. And I didn't realize that until I started getting into philosophy. And honestly, I started high school as one of the STEM kids. And then
Yeah.
I was huge into, I was going to be an aerospace engineer. I was going to take math classes, whatever. I failed physics almost. But then I was like, you know what? I'm going to take some philosophy and see where that takes me. And then after that, like I can't even think back to the time where I didn't think like I did right now, if that makes sense. So it really
Mm.
opens your eyes and it really reframes your perspective to think in ways and find solutions that you could never really do before.
Yeah, for sure. I guess going on with the subject of philosophy, how does one become more self-aware?
Oh man, self-awareness. Actually,
Yeah.
that's what we're learning in CX right now. For some
Yeah.
reason I just forgot, but yeah, we are
Yeah.
learning how to be self-aware.
Mhm.
So I think I'll just speak from personal experience because I think this really differs for everybody. I think we were talking before and you were talking about like having a moment of epiphany, which you kind of I guess people call it like a midlife crisis, maybe. But it's kind of
Mm.
where your whole world is like changed and you don't really know what's going on and you're forced to reframe your perspective to approach the new world or try to go back to the world that you were in. And that occurs to most people, I would say, but at different times. So I'll just share my unique perspective. So for me, being self-aware starts with who you surround yourself with, because we all inherently live in a bubble, right? So, like, we
For
don't
sure.
like to admit it, but our network is pretty limited by the people that we see every day, who we interact with. And as much as we also don't like to admit it, they influence us and we influence them. So it's kind of a feedback loop type of thing. So the old saying goes, like you are who you hang out around, which is honestly true. But I would say because that's true, you need to take extra effort to get out of your comfort zone and hang around people that don't think like you, that have really strange careers that you never even knew was a career. And it's only
Yeah.
when you start to diversify the people that you know, that's when you can really open up yourself to all the new possibilities of how to live life. And obviously, like you can't be self-aware if you are so limited by, you can only be this, or this, right? But you can start to actually look into yourself and you can start to, see what you actually want to be only when you have all the potential options. So I think that's the hardest part, stepping out of your comfort zone, but it's also the most fundamental step. And after that, I think everything just comes a bit more naturally. Like you meet different people, you're like, wow, I never knew you could do that. Or I never knew that you could take these steps to become or have such an unconventional career. And then maybe you start to wonder, hey, I could do that too. If I see that someone that I admire and I want to have a similar career to them, now that could be a possibility for me. So again, just diversify the people you're with. Be careful with who you hang out around for sure, but just take great effort to make sure and be deliberate to when choosing who you surround yourself with.
Yeah, that's a great response because that actually reminds me of this essay I was reading. It's called Your Life is Driven by Network Effects, which
Hmm.
basically says that like we're all like unconsciously being pulled around by different forces at play, depending on like what the environment or what quote unquote bubble we're in. And and this like the guy writing it, he was explaining how some of the most biggest decisions of our life, like where we go to college, what city we live in, who we surround ourselves with, they can have like a disproportionate effects on how our life is going to end up. And I feel like going back on the self-awareness thing, like you really have to be deliberate about these big decisions because they can radically transform your life one way or the other.
Yeah, I mean, they really do. And
Yeah,
one example that instantly comes to my mind is just choosing where I went to university,
for
right?
sure, for sure. Yeah,
So even just like taking the leap of faith, like no one knows what the heck is Minerva. Like I didn't even know like maybe 3 years ago, I had no idea what Minerva was. And if you told me I would go to this strange university, I would not have believed anybody. But just taking that leap of faith, choosing to go to a place where I knew that I would automatically be out of my comfort zone because there would be nobody who looked or came from the same background as me. So I would be literally forced to interact and become friends with people from very, very different backgrounds and like thinking, or I guess opinions. Yeah. So for sure, for sure.
Yeah, 100%. Yeah, so kind of going on to that, you back in high school graduation, and then 10 months later to now, what has changed about you and what you see about life and the world around you?
That's a good question. I
Yeah.
think, ooh, man, I feel like you can take that question to so many directions, but I think for me, I guess we're kind of talking about self-awareness. So I think when I had that epiphany moment, and I think for me that was probably a while before graduation. I think it was actually when I chose, around the time I chose to attend Minerva. That was my epiphany moment. And that was when I think looking back now, it was a not a catalyst. It's kind of like a point where my life took a different direction,
Mm,
if that
yeah.
makes sense. There's a term
Yeah.
for it, and I can't remember. So I think once you make that epiphany, there's not like any super big, huge changes that really challenge or like change you from that point on. It's just that decision that is super, super hard. But looking back now, I can say I definitely made the right decision. I know there's like some, cognitive bias that's, hindsight, it's always better. But
Yeah.
I like 99%, I'm 99% confident that I definitely made the right decision in that, catalyst moment.
Yeah. Was that decision like a hell yes? Or was it like something that you had to like deliberately think through and like, like kind of edge out the pros and cons?
Yeah, I'd say definitely the latter. Like, I think it would be so cool if I could say, oh, from the beginning, I was super unconventional and I really didn't care about what
Yeah,
anyone
yeah.
thought of me. But, that would be a lie. So I didn't like actually enroll and make my final college decision until pretty late because I was debating between a few schools and the other schools I had on my list were, traditional universities. If I
Yeah.
went, I would get a 4-year degree, stay in same place, have a normal college experience. But what happened was that I came back from a college tour and I got invited to kind of a college tour at Minerva. I wouldn't even call it a college tour because we don't really have a campus, so you're not
Yeah.
really
Yeah.
touring. You're more just interacting with the students. So the next day I got back to San Francisco and then I went to talk to some Minerva students, and I think now they're in Berlin, that class. But I got to interact with them, and I was like, wow, there is such a difference between like what I saw at Minerva versus like what I saw at a normal college. And if I see myself like 4 years later, I don't want to say that I missed out on an experience because, I was scared of social judgment or I was scared of missing out of a normal, college life. So I think that realization, I was like, you know what? I think it's worth the risk. And there was also, of course, there's multiple factors, like, being younger, I think you're more prone to taking risks because there's less at stake.
Right.
My thought process was literally like, if all else, like, if everything, goes wrong and I end up hating it, at least I'll graduate, hopefully, I'll be like 22, having been to, I wanted to go to at least like 20, 30 countries. And I think that's even that it's just worth the investment.
Mm.
So after weighing everything, it was still a really hard decision looking back. But as soon as I took the leap of faith, like I mentioned, like everything else just fell into place.
Yeah. It's pretty incredible like how young we still are. Like like we're both 18, right? And we have
Yeah.
this whole life ahead of us. And for this age right now to like think small and to play it safe, like I feel like we're just trapping ourselves in like in a box because we can do so many different things. We have more agency than we realize at such a
hmm
young age. And like to not take the risk, is taking the risk. So
Yeah, for sure.
yeah.
But I think if you're stuck in that bubble, it's just so hard to see because people can take that both ways. They can say, I have one life, I'm young. I can either go do amazing things with it and do like I'll say what mainstream considers like like courageous things, like taking a very unconventional path to college, taking a gap year, joining the military, whatever it might be. Or you can say, I only have one life. I don't want to screw up, so I'm going to play it safe and take the safer route. And that's not to
Yeah,
say that I'm telling those people not to do that, because honestly, some people are just happy doing that. Like they honestly just don't want to take risks, and they feel like they would 100% be more confident and comfortable if they stayed in their safe space, their bubble, whatever. And that's honestly
yeah,
like fine.
yeah,
Like there's
yeah,
nothing wrong with that. Like everybody's different, and that goes back to being self-aware and knowing what you want for yourself.
for sure.
But I'm mostly just talking to the people that, they want to take the risk and they have these opportunities, but they're scared of, making the wrong decision and not being able to reverse it and going back and choosing a different path. But, now looking back, I would just say that everything works out in the end. Like no matter how many my parents like to say like zigzags that you take,
Yeah, yeah,
we all end up in the final destination. So it's sort of like what do you want your life to be like, and what do you want that journey to be?
yeah, yeah. Kind of going back on what you said earlier, with your campus tours visiting a traditional university versus Minerva, what differences did you notice?
Okay, this is
Yeah.
like kind of biased, but the university
Oh
that
yeah,
I
yeah.
visited, it was their finals week. So obviously, like it was not in my favor
Oh
because
yeah, yeah.
every student I saw was so stressed, and they were, lining up outside of their lecture halls to go in and take a test.
Oh,
And I was like, oh man, like I do not want to do that for another 4 years. But then at Minerva, I think the first thing I realized was how diverse the people really are. Like obviously, 52 different countries, it's going to be diverse, but it's still, I would say, pretty different, because I think the Bay Area is diverse in the way that you see different people, but we have the same background. Like we have the same, socioeconomic status.
right, right.
So there's not that much of a difference. But if you meet people that actually come from different countries, like they've lived there and their culture is with that country, and they're not like Americanified, I guess. Like it's still such a big difference, and you can both learn so much from each other. So I think that was the first thing I realized. I was like, wow, I've never seen these many people from different countries all in one
Yeah,
place. um, so that was the first thing. And then second thing, honestly, it sounds cliche, but the students, like the Minervans that I talked to, they were so happy. Like they were the happiest college students I had ever
yeah,
seen in my life. And like being a Minerva student myself, I'm like, yes, I'm happy. I'm not happy like 100% of the time, obviously, but
yeah.
I would say I'm generally more happy than I was in high school, where I would say I was close to a traditional college experience.
Yeah. Yeah. Why do you think Minerva students are happier? Or yeah.
That's a good question, but
Yeah.
I think it comes back to being self-aware enough to know that you want a different experience. So if you know that, right? If you have that degree of self-awareness, that probably means you also know what your purpose is. And I
Sure.
know you're very into, finding your purpose, and I'm sure you can talk more about that on this podcast
Right,
in the
right.
future. But I think most Minerva students know what they want to do, which is what I would say most college students probably are still trying to figure out. And that was honestly me too. And sometimes I'm still doubting. But for the most part, Minerva students know their end goal. They know what they want to be, they know what they want to do. And they're willing to take very weird, unconventional steps to get there. So when you have a purpose, right, and you'll talk about this more, I'm sure, but
Yeah.
you'll automatically be more happier on average than somebody who's
Yeah.
just
Yeah.
wandering and doing what the crowd does because they don't have a purpose. So I think that's one thing. It just comes down to having a purpose and being courageous enough to choose a different path than what everybody else is choosing.
Yeah. I guess like when you do so, like you're aligned and attuned to your values and who you are internally. And you kind of project that through the work you do and the decisions you make. So yeah, kind of pivoting on the topic of happiness. Like, so for those of you who don't know, Emma's a writer and she has a blog. And in one of your pieces, you wrote, it's called The Pursuit of Happiness. So you wrote, this all-encompassing term, the pursuit of happiness, is meant to manifest differently for everybody. America as a whole remains a place where everybody has a fundamental right to pursue happiness, whatever that looks like to them. So I want to ask you personally, what does happiness mean to you?
Okay, so I think that kind of connects to the last question, but to me,
Yeah.
happiness links directly with purpose. Like, there's
Mm.
no way to find internal happiness if you don't have a purpose. And it's just that simple, right? Like, if you don't have a purpose, there's no way to be happy. And I don't know if it was this blog, maybe it was another blog. It was like my theory to happiness or whatever. But I talked about the two types of happiness. I talk about contentment, which is more of internalized long-term happiness. And then I talk about I think I just called it happiness, which is kind of like your daily up and downs. You know, you're having a good day, you find $5 on the ground, like you become happier, but then that ultimately evens out into your line of contentment. So the more content you are, the more happy you'll be long term, whereas the less content you are, the less happy that you'll be. And I think that level of contentment or long term happiness, internalized happiness, like I said, is directly linked with purpose. So for me, again, it starts with finding your purpose. And for me, this is so interesting because our last assignment that I was just working on this morning, it's about your purpose and you have to write a
Oh, no
purpose
way.
statement.
Yeah.
And this just reminds me of that.
Yeah.
But I wrote about my purpose being learning, or I called it critical learning, and then creating and inspiring. So I thought of it like this is more of a personal thing, but I thought of it more as a cycle. So I mentioned before I love learning, right? So I wanted to make it my purpose to continuously learn and not only learn, but learn critically. So to question what's currently out there and not to take everything I see as fact. I wanted to apply critical thinking skills to make my own conclusions and not just accept what society deems as correct, especially like politically. We can talk about that more later. And then the second part of that purpose is to create. So, like Justin said, I'm a writer, so I've been writing for quite some time now, across different, fiction, nonfiction. I do a bit of both. Um, so I would say my main medium and like form of communication would be through writing. So I would take what I learned, I would analyze it, I would reflect on it, and then I would output something through text. So that's the second part. And then the third part is kind of a continuous cycle. It's just, I would say inspiring. That sounds cliche, but I just want to, publish things out there and make it accessible for everybody so that they can start feeding somebody else's cycle of knowing and then creating and inspiring.
Right. Wow. Amazing answer. Kind of going back what you said, I have this interesting interview question that Peter Thiel, one of the Silicon Valley's like investors, always asks for an interview. He asks, "What is an important truth that very few people agree with you on?"
Ooh, about truths.
Yeah.
I don't I don't know if people would like disagree on it. But I would just say like how purpose is intertwined with happiness. Like I've already elaborated on it.
Mm.
But I that's just kind of a truth for me. Like you can't have one without the other. And the thing is, it's so easy to be fooled by the illusion of happiness. Like you could think that you're happy, like if you found $5 on the ground, or you could think you're happy if you got into a super prestigious college or landed a job offer, internship, whatever. But then long term, you'll return to that equilibrium stage of
Right.
contentment. So without purpose, like you can't find true happiness. So I feel like people, if you ask people, they'll be like, "Yeah, I agree." It's theoretical, but it sounds right. But I think in practice, that's when it becomes really hard because finding a purpose, man, that's
Yeah,
difficult.
it's a whole like life's work thing, just on that journey of finding your purpose. Yeah. Yeah, I guess going on that, it's a whole like arrival fallacy thing. It's like once I get into that college, I'll be happy. Or it's like once I retire, I'll be happy.
Hmm.
But there's something more deeper in play than just these like superficial checkpoints that you have to
Hmm.
reach.
Yeah, that definitely reminds me of what was it called? The arrival fallacy.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah, so that reminds me of it's more of a logical fallacy, but like changing the goalposts. And I feel like everybody has experienced that, right? Like you'll say, "Oh, I'll be happy when I do this," and then you accomplish that, and then it changes each time, and you realize that you never really end up happy because you always just set like new standards and new definitions for what it means to be happy.
For
And
sure, for
there's
sure.
there's so many sayings out there that's like, enjoy the journey and not the destination, which are super cliche. And like I said, like if you go ask anybody, they'll say, yes, I completely agree. I think we should be preaching this everywhere. But in practice, it's so hard because I think humans were kind of hardwired to want external validation and want to have all these awards and accolades. But once you kind of realize that truth and you internalize it, that's when you'll really start to see a shift in what you
Yeah.
value and your level of happiness.
Yeah. Yeah. Why do you think people chase these things?
Because I mean, this sounds so bad, but
Yeah.
honestly,
Yeah.
I think speaking from personal experience, it's when I really didn't have a purpose, or if I was when I was between purposes, I would say. So if
Mm,
I didn't really have a solid identity of myself, then I would try to form my identity in external things. And I think that's one of the main problems with people not having self-awareness and not having a personal mission or purpose or whatever is they'll start to define themselves by what society tells them to be. So, for example, if you just take a high schooler, like growing up in Silicon Valley, I'll just take an example from our own lives.
yeah.
Like if they don't know who they want to be, right? Which most high schoolers don't, obviously. Like I went into high school, I had no idea what I wanted to do. I wanted to be a physicist. That obviously didn't work out. So if you just have
Yeah.
a high schooler going into high school, they don't know what they want to be. They're going to conform to what everybody else is because one, it's so much easier, right? You don't have to think. You just do what everyone else does.
Yeah.
And two, you'll be rewarded for that by either societal acceptance, you'll get awards, you'll get compliments, you'll get whatever it is that you're seeking. So you'll get sucked into that cycle. And once you're in that cycle, you'll start to tell people, my purpose is to become whatever it is that society's telling you to be. And because you haven't internalized that, it's all external. So you need some metric for happiness, right? Everybody does. We're just emotionless people. You'll start setting
Yeah.
those goals and standards to be what, again, society tells you to be. So
Yeah.
I think everybody has experienced that in some way, shape, or form. It's just so hard to break out of this. Like I think you like to call it like breaking out of the matrix, right? Or
Yeah.
like taking the red
100%. 100%.
pill.
It's so hard to break out because I mean, I guess like coming from personal experience, when you've been in that path for so long and you've received so much praise and approval for it, it's almost like you can't live without it. But once you do kind of like go to the other path, you're kind of like, oh, where did all this approval go? Like, why do I feel like so bad about myself? But then you kind
Hmm.
of realize that the self-worth doesn't come from other people's approval. It has to come from within. And that takes a lot of work. You have to like
For
go from like
sure.
rock bottom, ground zero, and then you have to like
Yeah.
painfully make your way up. Like,
Yeah, you're basically just starting over. And I think it's so prevalent, especially in at least in piano, right? Since you play piano, like
yeah,
it's just competitions. Like it's built in from
yeah,
level 1 to level 10 and beyond. Like I don't really know how it works. But it's really similar for writing as well. Like I think all creative arts, it's turned into some kind of competition, which honestly I don't really
yeah,
understand. I don't know why. Like I understand math competitions, science, whatever, but suddenly there's creative arts competitions. But in high school, when I started writing, I was looking into these competitions and I didn't necessarily want to enter. Like, I was always reluctant to enter because I was not necessarily scared of losing, but I just didn't really see the value in it because most of them, they would just give you a prompt and you would have to write according to that prompt. And that's basically how writing goes. But for me, like that was never why I started writing. Like I didn't start to write because I wanted to win a competition, right? Like I wanted to write whatever I wanted to write. But then once you start winning those prizes, like you said, like it just fuels the external desire
yeah,
for
100%.
external motivation or what is it like external validation. Yeah, that's it.
Right.
And you start to become addicted to it and you want more and more and more. And when that clashes with authenticity and your purpose, that's when you really have to stop and consider, do I really want to be chasing this or do I want to be chasing, I guess, my heart? Again, very cliche, but I'd say the best way to put it.
Yeah. Did you have like this epiphany moment where you kind of knew that this whole path of like social validation wasn't for you?
Yeah, I would say when I lost, well, not
Like,
lost, but when I didn't
uh,
win, I'd say you can't really lose a writing
yeah,
contest.
yeah.
But when I didn't win a writing contest, I would say like I would say I was pretty confident that I would at least get something, and that sounds so bad, like looking back now. But you know, the whole creative industries are all super subjective, which again, why I have an issue with contests in the first place. But I tend to write very unconventional things in that it's really hard to like get people to read it because it's not what they would typically pick up in a bookstore or library.
Mm,
So, for example, the book I'm writing right now is military fiction, which when I tell people, they're like, "What? Like, is that even a genre?" And it's really funny because I like my family has no connection to the military whatsoever, but I still chose like the weirdest genre to write about. And because of that, and because of the fact that nobody knows what it is, it's really hard to go, you know, pitch your book to people. And especially if I wanted to go and get traditionally published, that would be an additional barrier I would have to face. Whereas if I was writing a super popular book in a super popular genre like fantasy, romance, I don't even know what's popular anymore, and then I were to go pitch that, one could argue that it's saturated, but I think for the most part, you have a better chance of getting published just
mm,
because it follows what the mainstream wants to see. So it was kind of that realization of, or, you know, not even just like not winning a writing contest, but just not being able to go the traditional path because of this, like not being able to win more awards or get published traditionally. And I really had to stop and consider, like, again, do I want to continue writing this book that I really want to write? Like, I think it has taught me so much about myself and it's led me to places I never would have gone otherwise.
mm.
Or do I want to become conventionally successful and try to write what people want to actually read, you know?
Yeah,
And ultimately, I was like, you know what, writing is my thing. You know, I could go to a conventional school, I could get good grades, like that's fine, but I have to have like my purpose is mine, and I can't change my purpose to meet somebody else's needs or happiness or wants. So I decided to just sacrifice that. And that's why when people say, no, are you going to become a professional writer or author? Probably not, unless I become super rich, and I could just write books for the rest of my life. And I think it's for that reason I don't want to sacrifice authenticity for marketability, especially when it starts to conflict with my purpose.
yeah, it's a tough battle, but I
It
think
is, yeah.
I think you're onto something. Yeah, hit me up in like 10 years in the future. We'll
Yeah,
see you
maybe.
on.
We'll see.
Yeah, who knows, you know? Yeah, I guess kind of going into the topic of writing. So, I mean, I've been writing casually for like, I don't know, 2, 3 years, just journaling every day. Some occasionally writing blog posts. I want to ask for some, you know, writing advice. It's like, how do you write with clarity?
Clarity. Okay. That's
Yeah,
a good question. I think for writing advice, honestly, there's so much about online.
yeah,
But for me, it's just practice. Like honestly,
mm,
all creators know that you create what you consume. Like if you consume trash, you know, you're gonna output
yeah.
trash. Like if you only read Reddit posts, you're not gonna write something of great value. Like that's kind
That's
of the
true.
truth, right?
Yeah,
Um, so it really depends on what you're trying to write. For me, for example, if I am writing fiction, I'm going to want to consume a lot of fiction, and usually in a very similar genre that I'm writing in, both to know, you know, what's popular in that genre, just in case I want to go down the traditional route, or even just to get inspiration for my book. Because again, you consume what, or you create what you consume.
right.
So if you want to write with clarity, with articulation, you got to find authors or you got to find writers that you admire and do that well. And I feel like that's pretty easy. You know, there's a ton of writers online that are very accessible. So go read their work. Definitely consume a lot, like read it all. And you don't even
Yeah,
have to be like taking notes or anything. Like it's very passive. Like it kind of goes through osmosis into your mind. So when you start writing, you'll see it reflected. It's such a weird thing,
it's
but
magic.
yeah, it really
Yeah,
is.
yeah.
But I definitely see that, at least in fiction. Like I read one book that's written in a very weird style. And then with that night when I start to write, I start to change my whole writing style. And I'm like, wait, where did that come from?
Yeah.
But you really do like learn through osmosis. just like magic.
Yeah, so for people who like want to get into writing, or they only have experience, doing writing in like school, they probably encounter this thing called writer's block. So have you experienced this? And like, if you do, how does one overcome it?
Hmm.
Yeah.
I wouldn't even call it writer's block. I would generalize it and say just creative
Mm.
block or just block,
Yeah, yeah.
And I think it's overhyped to be honest. Like it definitely exists, but I think it's more of just having good days and bad days. And that goes for everything. Like I said, so some days for me, some days are just good writing days. I'm super inspired. Maybe it could be I just read a really good book, or I just got like I had a dream last night that was very related to my book and now I want to write it down. Like it could be anything. And some days are just like that. Whereas other days are not like that. And I would say that most days are not like that, at least recently,
Yeah.
because I've had a lot less time to write in college. Um, so I don't necessarily say, like I'm experiencing writer's block. It's more of just lack of inspiration. But I think there's a lot of techniques that can help you overcome writer's block. And I think the first one that works the best for me is building habit and building a structured routine. So we actually learned about this also in CX of how to build habits and how to
Mm,
get rid of habits.
yeah.
But you just gotta continuously do it. So for example, for me, I've been writing every day since I was 14. Like I have not skipped a day. And some
Kudos,
days,
kudos.
yeah,
Yeah, yeah.
I mean, some days it's not great, like some days I just so tired. I just open my computer, I look at my dog, I'm like, not today. Like I literally cannot do it today, but I still force myself to write something. Like it could be like 100 words, like
Yeah.
it's not a ton, but and maybe it's like really trash. And when I'm writing, I'm like, I'm definitely gonna delete this tomorrow when I read back. But I force myself to write anyway because one, it's just structure, right? Like I feel like if I skip a day now, it's just gonna feel weird. It's like skipping brushing your teeth, and hopefully you guys brush your teeth. It's kind of
Yep.
like skipping a day on something when you've already built a habit doing that.
Right.
And then second, I don't know if that's true for all creatives, but at least for me, if I skip a day, then I lose momentum. And then the next day, I feel even less motivated to write. And that has happened to me when I was working on my third book. I was doing this thing called National Novel Writing Month. It's called NaNoWriMo. And I wrote $50,000. I wrote 50,000 words.
Yeah.
I wish. I wrote 50,000 words in 20-ish days. And that was fun. Like
Wow.
it was hard, but it was fun. But
Yeah.
I got so burnt out after. I was like, I'll take a 1 day break. And that 1 day turned into 6 months. And I have not touched that book
Oh,
since then. So I learned. And now I just don't skip a day. And of course, this like might be different for all creatives.
yeah.
Like, do you find that that's the case for you? Like, I don't know, like your schedule or anything,
Yeah, like
but
I mean, if you read Atomic Habits from James Clear, he's like, don't miss a day
yeah,
because that day can turn into, it can just like build up a snowball of like
yeah.
missing the rest of the days to follow. Yeah, I feel like for me, since my identity is so wrapped up, being a musician, I cannot not do music.
Hmm.
So there's always that, kind of like what you said, that itch of, always going back to writing. I feel the
Hmm.
same way for music. And it's like it doesn't have to be, like practicing. It can also be just like listening to music. But as long like I'm indulged in some form of musical discipline, I feel like that kind of satisfies my soul.
Hmm.
Yeah, so I think, identity is also plays a big role in how well you keep in habit.
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah,
I mean, I think it goes back to priorities too. Like if it's part of your identity, if it's part of your purpose, then it's got to be a priority, right?
yeah, for sure, for sure.
And if it's a priority, then by definition, you have to do it. It's like it has to be at the
Yeah,
top of your
yeah,
priorities list. So it makes sense. It makes sense.
yeah,
But I
by
guess the snowball
definition.
effects, yeah, I guess it can be generalized then. So if you're trying to build a habit, then I guess don't miss a day.
Yes, don't miss a day, guys. Yeah, so going a bit deeper into writing, because you kind of write different styles. So you write fiction books, and on your blog you write argumentative and like nonfiction stuff. So
Mhm.
like, is there like a difference in approach when you write one or the other?
Yeah, I think a lot of people are confused when when I just say writing because, and I'm also confused because it
Yeah.
encompasses such a broad range of
Right. Right.
subgenres. So, like you just mentioned, there's fiction, there's nonfiction. Under nonfiction, you have a whole like more like sub branches. Like you
Yeah.
have like essays, you have argumentative, you have narratives, you have memoirs and whatever. And then under fiction again, like you have, children's, middle grade, young adult, and then under that you have like fantasy, general fiction, romance, whatever. So I think the approach that you take to each one of those is going to be different. Obviously, I'd say creative writing. It's all narratives, right? Like by definition, it's creative. So there has to be a story. If I take that same approach and apply it to my argumentative blog, it's not going to be an argumentative blog
Yeah.
anymore.
Right. Right.
Like you're just changing like what it
Yeah.
is. So you're changing its identity, right? Speaking of identities. Um, so for me, I would say I'm more into fiction than I am into blog writing. I actually need to get back into blog writing. I feel like I've skipped too many days for sure.
Oh.
But I think the approaches I would take, I mean, this is probably a whole other podcast of its own of like how to write a book, how to write a blog.
Oh yeah, for sure.
But I would just say it's pretty different and it really depends. I would say if we're talking about mediums, like it really depends on what you're trying to express because different mediums, your methods and techniques they're going to change. And if you're trying to express a message through music, it's going to be very different, like the tools that you have at your disposal than if you were to write a blog or a book about it. So I guess it just depends,
Yeah.
like what you want to say and how you want to say it.
Yeah, that's great. I guess wrapping up with some rapid fire questions.
Okay.
So nowadays, what drives you?
What
What
drives
dri
me?
Yeah, what drives you to like get up every day and do the work that you're doing?
Oh man.
Yeah.
My alarm clock, honestly. It's a lame
Yeah.
answer. I think my whole schedule has been like very like flipped upside down since I got to college. Like I used to be a person with a pretty like strict routine, I would say. Like not necessarily like
Mm,
I had to be somewhere at a certain place, but I like routine because it was predictable and I knew that, if I went through the steps, I would have everything done. And like I'm not a huge, I guess, like time blocking person because a lot of people ask me about my time management techniques, and honestly, I just have a to-do list and I get it all done somehow.
yeah. Yeah.
But in college, my well thought out plans kind of just all go out the window because everybody, it might be a Minerva thing or it might be a general college thing, I'm not too sure, but it's so spontaneous. Like I remember the second day I was here, I had such a good plan. I was like, I'm gonna go get bagels for breakfast, and then
Oh
I'm
yeah.
going to Yerba Buena Gardens, and I'm gonna go walk by the ferry plaza. And then that morning at 7 a.m., someone was like, hey, do you want to go to, I don't know, like Twin Peaks with me? And I was like, sure, let's do it. And that's what I ended up doing that day. Did not end up doing anything else on my
Hmm.
list. So it's not really a plan that drives me anymore because I've kind of learned to live spontaneously. And I think I just wrote a blog about that, like learning how to live spontaneously and
Right. Right.
changing up how, like, what drives you. Um, so honestly, I'm not gonna lie, I have very lame, I guess, like drivers right now. Like I'm looking forward to next weekend because it's a
Yeah.
weekend. I'm looking forward to break because
Hmm.
it's break. But in the long term, I'm definitely looking forward to learning more about pretty much anything. We just did our course selections for next year, and just looking at the course descriptions, I'm super excited to get into those classes because I feel like it's going to challenge me. It's going to challenge my thinking and what I already know, and it's really going to encourage me to know more about not only that topic but myself, and of course travel. Like we're heading to Taiwan in a few months, which is crazy. I feel like we just
Well,
arrived in San
that is
Francisco.
amazing. Yeah.
It's crazy. But yeah, it's gonna be tiring, but I am super looking forward to that.
Yeah. I guess going on the whole spontaneous thing, like I feel like a lot of people originally they think like, oh, the way to approach life is like optimization, plan every single thing out. But then you kind of realize over time that like, oh, life isn't like that.
Mm-mm.
Life throws punches at you. You gotta like adapt and you just have to go with the flow.
Yeah, I
Yes.
would say throw punches back. Like why
Yeah,
not?
throw punches back. Yeah.
Yeah, I'd say, I mean, that kind of goes back to living outside of your comfort zone for sure. I mean, we're humans, right? We're not algorithms. Algorithms always want to be optimized, they want to be efficient. But
Yeah,
humans, I mean, again, it really depends on your end goal, right? Like we all want to get there, and we all want to optimize some aspect to get to where we want to be. But, the old saying holds true, like don't forget to just slow down, enjoy the little things. And I would say just be spontaneous because you never know where those decisions could lead you. And like I mentioned at the start of this podcast, we will all end up at the same place, like sooner or later. So it just
100%.
it's
Yeah.
just the path that you want to take to get there. Like, do you want to have this experience or do you want to have like that experience? So just the choices that you make kind of determine that. And I guess that's kind of a discussion on fate and free will, but that's definitely for another
Yeah, yeah.
podcast.
Yeah, I guess like wrapping up with one last question. Here it goes. Um, if you were to pass along a single message to your freshman self, what would you say?
Man, my freshman self would not take advice from me. Like, I'll just preface with that.
Yeah,
Um, because I feel like freshman self, I was just looking for advice. And I feel like there's so much advice floating out there. Not
yeah,
all of them are good, right? But some of them are like hidden gems, but they all make sense theoretically. It just practically, when you try to apply it, it just doesn't really work out because it's hard.
yeah,
So man, if I were to give myself one piece of advice, like practical advice, I would say start exploring alternative paths to education. Because I think that's
yeah, yeah.
one thing. It's very practical, right? It's not like,
Right.
stop and smell the roses. So I would definitely tell my freshman self that. I don't know. Again, I don't know if you would listen to me. Probably not. But on a more theoretical aspect, I would encourage my freshman self to really find my purpose, right? And that's very hard because, again, finding your purpose is probably the hardest thing in life. But you're really never too young or too old to get started. So it's always good to start young, explore new things. You never know what sticks.
Yeah, great. All right, Emma. Thanks for being the very first guest of the podcast.
Yeah, thanks for having me. It was great.
Man, that was a great conversation. Like if this is just episode one, I don't know like what other future episodes are cooking. So
Yeah, man,
yeah.
I'm looking forward to listening to all of them.
All right. Yeah, thanks for tuning in and we'll see you next time. Peace.